And welcome back to our discussion about Down Below. My name is Steve.
I'm Ian. Thanks for falling through the cracks.
And yesterday we started off by talking about some things that made our project different than other similar projects throughout the history of gaming. Today we're going to talk about something that makes the setting a bit unique from traditional cyberpunk settings. Similarly, one thing that is true going back to the very beginning of the cyberpunk movement is that characters are motivated largely by three things: money, greed, and revenge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in this setting, the characters that you're likely to be playing are not as likely to be motivated by the first two.
Revenge is a common thread throughout any human story, and actually becomes a little bit more common partly through the removal of the first two in this game. Another thing that we will touch on today is the fact that while dystopia and cyberpunk go hand in hand like peanut butter and jelly, utopia and cyberpunk usually don't mix very well at all.
It's mostly because of the punk part of cyberpunk. Mm-hmm. Part of the cyberpunk movement is the rebellion and the acting against the culture and the machine, which is also why I have a problem with calling certain things steampunk, diesel punk, etc. punk, because in most of these it's just the visual aesthetic. There's no actual punk rebellion ethos to it.
There's a whole other subject that we could get into
there. It really is.
And maybe we will do a series of literature discussions sometime because we've got a lot to say about it. But the point about utopia is that in this setting, we do actually want to portray that there are large portions of the world for which there is a functional utopia for most people, and that's what makes the dystopian cyberpunk elements in this setting stand out so much.
So when I said there wasn't really greed as a motivating factor, that's kind of true. It's not that players are not necessarily motivated by the acquisition of stuff or power or position, but there's not a lot of immaterial wealth to be had. The monetary system is, well, functional, and the controls on the monetary system are such that using that money outside the system is practically pointless. In a lot of traditional cyberpunk situations, you can make a living as an arms dealer, for instance, by selling your ill-gotten gains for money, which you can then turn around and put back into the system and say, yes, I totally earned this fancy house with these classic paintings hanging on the wall. And that's not the case in Downbelow. In Downbelow, the money you earn is pretty much directly earmarked from the central computer straight to you, and if it's transferred, the reasons for the transfer are also marked. And while there are people who go about mismarking transfers and lying about reasons, there's so much possible security on there that an illicit shadow economy is largely honestly, it's largely the province of the conspiracies that we talked about in some of the last updates, not the private citizens who are working outside the system.
Essentially, the economic factors of security on the one side and what is actually needed by the people in the underground economy on the other side have conspired to say that money is only a thing for the legitimate economy. The sub-economy, which has existed since there were economies and taxations, and so black markets come into existence, the illegitimate, the outsider economy doesn't use money because money is a tool of the utopia, and in the dystopian part of society where things don't work right and so people work outside the system, and the cause and effect do sometimes go the other way. But the point is, when those things are true, money is not the tool of choice. Instead, people tend to know each other, have systems of favors, which they end up being systems of credit similar to money, but the same money does not translate.
Now, this isn't to say that money is entirely pointless. After all, stuff has to come from somewhere. For stuff to get infused into the economy, there has to be some exchange of value, and the way that's represented is with the monetary and the credit system. But once it's in the system, it tends to be traded around on the credit of favors, on the credit of reputation, on the credit of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Certain people who are interfaces between the down below part of the world and the rest of the world, people like mob accountants, they will tend to maintain actual credit accounts in the legitimate world as well as having their position in the Downbelow world.
So that's one of the majorly unique things about this setting as a cyberpunk setting goes. The characters, again, are not likely to be motivated very much by personal greed or by the simple acquisition of wealth, but more likely to be motivated by desperation or a cause of some sort.
So, let's talk about the utopian aspect and the implication of that to this setting. When you first pitched this setting to me,
right,
you talked about how you wanted to do a cyberpunk set in a utopia. And we eventually came to realize that to communicate this idea, we were going to have to tell people about the dystopia aspect, because really there is something wrong with the system, and that's why there are the cracks.
Right.
But tell me about this utopia and why you wanted to create that part to set the cyberpunk things up for what they are.
There's a lot to talk about with that, but not a lot to say. Okay. Really, the reason was that there's no utopian fiction anymore. That's it. That's honestly the reason. Nobody writes utopias. Everybody says the future is going to be horrible, and big government is going to be awful, and everything's going to fall apart, and nothing's going to work, and it's going to be horrible, and only the top 0.0003% are going to have anything resembling a culture, and everyone else is going to look at them. And that's boring. That's dumb. That sells a few books, and then it becomes commonplace, and suddenly nobody's looking for the good anymore. Instead, I wanted to tell a story where things worked. But that's also boring, because if everything works, then where's the drive? And this is a problem that utopian fiction has, and one of the reasons that the classics of Star Trek worked so well, for instance, was that when they posited a utopian future, they also posited that there would be problems coming from outside. I took a slightly different tack when I was looking at putting this one together, because at present there really isn't an outside. The first question I asked was, could this be multiple possible utopian nations on Earth, or possibly even multiple utopian local colonies? And that quickly came around to the answer of, if you're that close to each other and you're not cooperating, it's not utopia. It's warfare. It's 1984. It's a dystopia, which led to the idea that, okay, nobody's at war. There are no big official wars. There is a complete worldwide peace, and so the only place for things to go wrong is the driving factor in this case is that while it works perfectly well for the vast majority of people, those people who do not fit the nice, neat molds of their respective societies and are not able to find a society in whose mold they fit will fall through the cracks.
So, as a final note on unique aspects of the setting, this not only created the entire idea of the between the cracks, the down below, being what it is, but it also creates this interesting and unique direction for a story to go, which most cyberpunk doesn't focus on, which is the possible way out. There are a couple of different way out stories, and we'll talk in more depth about them later, but it's actually possible for a character to achieve their denouement in a Downbelow story by getting out of the Downbelow economy and getting either back into or into, in the first place, a place in society where they can actually benefit from the utopian benefits of being part of the major societies. So, thanks for listening in on this chat where we talked about unique setting elements, and we'll be back tomorrow with some more unique ideas from the Downbelow RPG.